The afternoon sun beat down on Fort Anderson as soldiers filed into the mess hall after a brutal morning of training exercises. The air conditioning was broken again, and the combination of heat, exhaustion, and hunger made everyone a bit on edge. Among the crowd was Captain Rebecca Hayes, a 28-year-old infantry officer who had just completed a 6-mile run in full gear under the scorching sun. Rebecca had been in the military for 7 years now. She wasn't the loudest person in the room or someone who demanded attention. In fact, most people would describe her as quiet and focused. She did her job well, earned the respect of her unit through actions rather than words, and never looked for drama or conflict. Her uniform bore the marks of someone who'd actually seen combat. 2 deployment patches, a bronze star, and the kind of worn edges that came from real work, not just ceremony. She grabbed a tray from the stack and moved through the food line. Meatloaf today. Not great, but after the morning she'd had, anything would do. She took her portions: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, a bread roll, and a cup of coffee that looked like it had been sitting since breakfast. The mess hall was packed, louder than usual. Conversations bounced off the walls as soldiers unwound from the morning's intensity. Rebecca balanced her tray carefully as she turned to find a seat. That's when it happened. She didn't see him coming from her left side. Lieutenant David Porter, a supply officer who'd joined the base about 8 months ago, walked right into her path while looking at his phone. Their trays collided. Not hard, but enough that Rebecca's coffee sloshed over the rim and splashed onto Porter's uniform sleeve. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Rebecca said immediately, reaching for napkins from a nearby table. "I didn't see you there. Let me help." She didn't get to finish her sentence. Porter's face went red. Not the embarrassed red of someone who'd just walked into another person while distracted. This was different. This was anger. His jaw clenched and his eyes narrowed in a way that made the soldiers nearby stop talking and turn to look. "You stupid," he started, his voice rising above the general noise of the mess hall. "Do you have any idea how much this uniform costs? Do you even look where you're going?" Rebecca stepped back, confused by the intensity of his reaction. "Lieutenant, I apologize. It was an accident." An accident?" Porter cut her off, his voice getting louder. "You people think you can just do whatever you want, don't you? Think the rules don't apply to you?" The mess hall was getting quieter now. More heads turning. Rebecca felt her face flush, but she kept her voice calm and professional. "I said I was sorry. It was completely unintentional. I'll pay for the dry cleaning if—" What happened next would replay in Rebecca's mind for weeks afterward, and in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. Porter moved fast. His hand came up and connected with Rebecca's face in a sharp, open-palmed slap that echoed through the now silent mess hall. The sound was like a crack of thunder. Rebecca's head snapped to the side, her eyes wide with shock more than pain. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed, but Porter wasn't done. While Rebecca stood there, frozen in disbelief, with her hand moving slowly to her stinging cheek, Porter grabbed her tray. With both hands, he lifted it and dumped the entire contents over her head. Meatloaf slid down her face. Mashed potatoes plopped onto her shoulders. Green beans scattered across the floor. The coffee, still warm, soaked into her hair and dripped down her back. "That's what happens when you don't watch where you're going," Porter said, his voice dripping with contempt. He stood there, chest puffed out, like he'd just won some kind of victory. The mess hall remained absolutely silent. 300 soldiers, and you could have heard a pin drop. Rebecca stood there, gravy running down her uniform, mashed potatoes sliding off her shoulder. Her hands were at her sides, trembling slightly. Not from fear. Not even from anger. From the sheer shock of what had just happened. In 7 years of service, through 2 combat deployments, through every challenge she'd faced, nothing had prepared her for this kind of public humiliation. She could feel every eye in the room on her. Could sense the phones coming out. People recording, the moment being captured from a dozen different angles. In the back of her mind, she knew this would be everywhere within the hour. The whole base would see it. Maybe more than just the base. Part of her wanted to react, wanted to defend herself. She was a trained soldier, a combat veteran. She could have responded in a way that would have made Porter regret his actions immediately. But something held her back. Maybe it was discipline. Maybe it was the awareness that any reaction she gave right now would only make things worse. Maybe it was the understanding that this moment was bigger than just her and Porter. Slowly, deliberately, Rebecca reached up and wiped a glob of mashed potatoes from her left eye. She looked at Porter, who was still standing there with that self-satisfied expression on his face like he'd just put someone in their place. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, but clear enough that everyone nearby could hear. "Understood, Lieutenant." That was all she said. 2 words. No threats, no anger, no breaking down. Just those 2 words, spoken with a calmness that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Then Rebecca turned and walked toward the exit. Not running, not rushing. She walked with her back straight, her head up. Even as food continued to drip from her hair and uniform, every step felt like a mile. Every eye felt like a weight. But she didn't falter, didn't stumble, didn't give Porter or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her break. As she pushed through the mess hall doors and stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, she could hear the explosion of noise behind her. Everyone talking at once, arguing, shouting. Some voices defending her. Others trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Rebecca kept walking. She made it to her barracks, went straight to her room, closed the door, and only then did she allow herself to react. She sat on the edge of her bed, still covered in food, and took a deep breath. Her cheek still stung where Porter had hit her. Her uniform was ruined. Her dignity had been attacked in front of hundreds of people, but as she sat there, something crystallized in her mind. She thought about all the training she'd received. Not just combat training, but training in military law, in proper procedures, and how the system was supposed to work. She thought about every time she'd seen someone abuse their authority and get away with it. She thought about every soldier who'd ever been mistreated and felt powerless to do anything about it. Rebecca stood up, walked to her desk, and pulled out a notepad. She began writing down everything that had happened, every detail, every word spoken, while it was still fresh in her mind. Because she knew something that Porter apparently didn't know, something that would become very important in the days ahead. There were rules, there were procedures, and there were consequences for breaking them. No matter who you were or who you thought you were, Porter had just made the biggest mistake of his military career, and Rebecca was going to make sure he understood that. Not through violence or revenge, but through the very system they'd both sworn to uphold. As she wrote, her phone began buzzing with messages. Word was already spreading. The video was already circulating. And whether she wanted it or not, Rebecca Hayes had just become the center of something much bigger than a ruined lunch. Rebecca's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. She'd changed out of her ruined uniform, showered off the mashed potatoes and gravy, and tried to collect her thoughts. But the messages kept coming. Text after text, calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Even her sister from back home had somehow already heard about it and was calling to check if she was okay. The video had gone viral on the base within 30 minutes. Within an hour, it had jumped to social media. Someone had posted it with the caption, "This is what happens at Fort Anderson," and it was spreading like wildfire. Rebecca sat on her bed, watching her phone light up again and again, feeling a strange mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. She wasn't crying. She'd done that for about 5 minutes in the shower, and that was enough. Now she felt something else. Determination, maybe, or clarity. She knew what she needed to do, and she knew she needed to do it the right way. Rebecca pulled out her laptop and opened a fresh document. She'd already written down her immediate recollection of events. Now she needed to prepare a formal complaint. She'd been working with the base's legal office for the past 6 months as part of her additional duties, so she knew exactly what format was required. She knew which regulations Porter had violated, and she knew how to make sure this went through the proper channels. As she typed, there was a knock on her door. Rebecca hesitated, then walked over and opened it. Standing there was Sergeant Kelly Morrison, one of the other women in her unit. Kelly's face was tight with anger. "Ma'am, I just saw the video. Are you okay? Please tell me you're filing a complaint. Please tell me you're not just letting this go." Rebecca stepped aside to let Kelly in. "I'm documenting everything right now. I'll file first thing tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow?" Kelly's voice rose. "Why not right now? That man assaulted you in front of everyone. He should be in custody right now." "Because I want to do this right," Rebecca said calmly. "I want every detail perfect. I want my statement airtight. If I rush this while I'm still emotional, I might miss something important." Kelly sat down on the desk chair, shaking her head. "You're stronger than me. If someone did that to me, I'd have knocked him flat right there in the mess hall." "That's exactly what he wanted," Rebecca replied. "Did you see his face after he dumped that food on me? He was waiting for me to react. waiting for me to hit him back or lose control. Then he'd be the victim. Then I'd be the one facing charges. Kelly was quiet for a moment. I never thought of it that way. That's how people like him operate, Rebecca said, sitting back down at her laptop. They push you until you break, then use your reaction against you. But I'm not giving him that satisfaction. After Kelly left, Rebecca worked for another 2 hours on her statement. Every detail. The exact time. Who was present. What was said word for word. The fact that Porter had approached from her left while looking at his phone. The coffee splash that started it all. The slap, the food dumping. Her response. Everything. The next morning, Rebecca walked into the office of Colonel Patricia Williams, the base commander. She'd requested an emergency meeting and, to her surprise, had been granted one immediately. What Rebecca didn't know was that Colonel Williams had already seen the video. In fact, Williams had been up half the night watching it repeatedly. Her anger growing with each viewing. Colonel Williams was a 48-year-old career officer who'd worked her way up through the ranks at a time when women in the military faced even more obstacles than they did now. She'd seen it all, dealt with it all, and she had exactly zero tolerance for the kind of behavior she'd witnessed on that video. Captain Hayes, Williams said as Rebecca entered, standing at attention. Sit down. And before you say anything, I want you to know that I've already initiated a preliminary inquiry. I saw the video at 1900 hours yesterday evening, and by 2000 hours, Lieutenant Porter was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Rebecca felt something release in her chest. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected the base commander to act so quickly without her even filing a complaint yet. Ma'am, I've prepared a formal statement, Rebecca said, pulling out the printed pages she'd spent hours perfecting. Williams took the papers and began reading. Her expression grew darker with each paragraph. When she finished, she set them down and looked directly at Rebecca. This is thorough. Very thorough. You've documented everything perfectly. Williams paused. But I need to tell you something. This isn't the first time Porter's name has come across my desk. Rebecca's eyes widened. Ma'am? I can't give you details yet, but I can tell you that we're looking into his conduct at his previous duty station. There were incidents, complaints that were filed but somehow never seemed to go anywhere. Williams leaned back in her chair. What I'm about to tell you stays in this room for now. Porter's uncle is Congressman Richard Porter. Do you understand what that means? Rebecca felt her stomach drop. Of course, that explained so much. The arrogance, the confidence that he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. I understand, ma'am, but with all due respect, I don't care who his uncle is. What he did was assault. It was conduct unbecoming an officer, and it violates multiple articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. A thin smile crossed Williams's face. Good answer, because I don't care who his uncle is either. I've been in this uniform for 26 years, and I've seen too many people get away with too much because of who they're related to. Not on my base, not on my watch. Over the next few days, something unexpected happened. Soldiers started coming forward. First it was just a few, then more and more. They came to Rebecca's office, sometimes during duty hours, sometimes after. They knocked on her barracks door in the evening. They sent emails. All of them had stories. Private First Class Hannah Chen told Rebecca about how Porter had made inappropriate comments about her appearance during a supply inspection. She hadn't reported it because she was new to the base and didn't want to make waves. Specialist James Rodriguez described how Porter had thrown equipment at him during an inventory count, hitting him in the shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise. Rodriguez hadn't reported it because Porter told him nobody would believe a junior enlisted soldier over an officer. Staff Sergeant Angela Martinez, who'd been at the base for 3 years, shared the most disturbing story. Porter had cornered her in a supply room 6 months ago, standing too close, making comments that made her skin crawl. When she'd tried to leave, he'd blocked the door for several minutes before finally letting her pass. She'd been too scared to report it officially, but she'd told her friends. Several of them had similar stories. Rebecca listened to each person, documented each account, and with each story, she felt something building inside her. This wasn't just about what happened to her in the mess hall. This was about a pattern of someone who believed they were untouchable, using their position to intimidate and abuse others. She took all the information to Colonel Williams, who brought in the Criminal Investigation Division. CID agents began conducting formal interviews. They pulled Porter's personnel file from his previous assignments. And what they found made the mess hall incident look like just the tip of an iceberg. Porter had been transferred to Fort Anderson after what was officially called personality conflicts at Fort Carson. Before that, he'd been at Fort Hood, where a complaint had been filed but mysteriously withdrawn. The pattern was clear. Every time things got too hot, his uncle made some calls, pulled some strings, and Porter got transferred somewhere new to start fresh. But Rebecca had documentation, video evidence, multiple witnesses, and most importantly, she had a base commander who was done playing politics. Meanwhile, the story had broken beyond the base. News outlets picked it up. Female officer assaulted in military mess hall became a national headline. Advocacy groups for military members reached out. Politicians started asking questions. And suddenly, Fort Anderson was under a spotlight nobody had expected. Rebecca found herself thrust into a role she'd never wanted. Reporters tried to contact her. She declined all interviews, referring them to the public affairs office. But her silence spoke volumes. She wasn't doing this for attention or fame. She was doing it because it was right. 1 week after the incident, Rebecca received a call to report to Colonel Williams's office again. This time the CID chief was there too, along with the base's senior legal officer. They laid out what they'd found. 3 previous complaints at other bases, 5 new complaints from Fort Anderson. A trail of behavior that had been excused, overlooked, and covered up for years. "We're moving forward with a court-martial," Williams said. "Multiple charges, assault, conduct unbecoming. Article 93, cruelty and maltreatment, and we're recommending that the Inspector General's office investigate why his previous complaints never went anywhere." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me," Williams said. "You did this. You handled it the right way. You documented everything. You stayed professional when most people would have lost control. And you gave us everything we needed to make sure this sticks." As Rebecca left the office, she felt something she hadn't felt since that day in the mess hall. Hope, not just for herself, but for every soldier who'd ever been mistreated and felt powerless to do anything about it. The system didn't always work. But sometimes when you did everything right, when you refused to back down, when you stood up not just for yourself but for everyone who couldn't speak up, sometimes justice actually happened. The fight wasn't over. The court-martial was still ahead. Porter's uncle was already making noise about defending his nephew. But Rebecca knew something important. She'd already won the part that mattered most. She'd shown that standing up was possible, that doing the right thing the hard way could actually work. And that message was spreading far beyond Fort Anderson. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Rebecca was reviewing training schedules when her phone rang with a Washington, D.C. area code. She almost didn't answer, assuming it was another reporter who'd somehow gotten her direct number. But something made her pick up. "Captain Hayes, this is Linda Chen from Congressman Richard Porter's office. The congressman would like to speak with you about the situation involving his nephew." Rebecca felt her jaw tighten. She'd been expecting this, but not so directly. "I have nothing to discuss with the congressman. There's an ongoing investigation, and I've been advised to direct all inquiries through proper channels." "The congressman understands that." The woman's voice was smooth, practiced. "But he believes there may have been a misunderstanding. He'd like the opportunity to clear this up before things go any further. He's prepared to make certain arrangements that might benefit your career. Perhaps a transfer to a more prestigious posting? He has considerable influence with—" "Stop right there." Rebecca cut her off, her voice hard. "Are you seriously calling to offer me a bribe? To make me drop charges against someone who assaulted me?" There was a pause on the other end. "Captain Hayes, I think you're misunderstanding the congressman's intentions. He simply wants to find a resolution that works for everyone involved." "The resolution is a court-martial," Rebecca said. "And if the congressman attempts to interfere with a military investigation, that's a serious matter. I'm documenting this call. Have a good day." She hung up, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear but from anger. She immediately called Colonel Williams's office and reported the conversation. Within an hour, she was sitting with the base's legal team, recounting every word of the phone call. "They're getting desperate," Major Tom Bradford, the chief legal officer, said as he took notes. "This is exactly the kind of mistake we need them to make. Any attempt to influence your testimony or interfere with the investigation just adds to their problems." But can they actually stop this? Rebecca asked. I mean, he's a congressman. He has connections. Bradford leaned back in his chair. He has connections, yes. But so does Colonel Williams. And more importantly, this case now has public attention. If charges suddenly get dropped or disappear, people will notice. The media will notice. That's protection you didn't have before. What Bradford didn't mention was the conversation he'd had earlier that morning. Congressman Porter had indeed been making calls. To the base, to the Pentagon, to anyone who might listen. He was using every relationship he'd built over 15 years in Congress, calling in favors, applying pressure. But something unexpected was happening. People were pushing back. The story had struck a nerve, not just in the military but across the country. Social media was filled with people sharing their own stories of workplace harassment, of times they'd been mistreated by someone with power and connections. Rebecca had become, without wanting to, a symbol of something larger. And that made her harder to silence, but the pressure was taking its toll. Rebecca started noticing things, cars that seemed to follow her off base, strangers taking photos of her at the grocery store. Her social media accounts, which she'd locked down, were still somehow being screenshotted and shared. People were digging into her past, looking for anything they could use against her. One night she found an article online titled, "Who is Captain Rebecca Hayes?" It detailed her entire life story, her hometown, her high school, her college, even her parents' names and professions. There were quotes from people she'd gone to school with, most of them positive but taken out of context to sound different than intended. The article ended with vague questions about her real motivations for pursuing charges. She called her parents that night. Her father, a retired police officer, was furious. They're trying to intimidate you. That's what this is. They want you scared enough to back down. I know, Dad, but I'm not backing down. Good, her mother said on the other extension. We didn't raise you to run away from fights, especially when you're in the right. But honey, are you safe? Should you come home for a while? I can't. That's exactly what they want. If I leave, even temporarily, it looks like I'm running. Like I can't handle the pressure. Rebecca took a deep breath. I have to see this through. The investigation continued to expand in ways nobody had anticipated. The CID agents found something interesting when they dug into Porter's transfer from Fort Hood. The official paperwork said, routine reassignment, but there had been an incident. A female soldier had filed a complaint about Porter cornering her during a night shift in the supply depot. She'd claimed he'd made unwanted advances and had physically blocked her from leaving. The complaint had been filed. An investigation had been opened. And then suddenly, the complainant had withdrawn her statement and requested a transfer to another base. Case closed. Porter moved on to his next assignment. The CID tracked down that soldier. Her name was Specialist Victoria Reyes, and she was now stationed in Germany. When they contacted her, she initially didn't want to talk. But when she heard about what happened at Fort Anderson, something changed. I withdrew my complaint because I was told it would be better for my career. Victoria told them over a video call. Porter's uncle got involved. Someone from his office called my commander. Suddenly I was being encouraged to reconsider whether I really wanted to ruin a promising officer's career over a misunderstanding. They made it clear that pushing forward would be bad for me. Would you be willing to make a formal statement now? The CID agent asked. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Will it matter this time? Or will they just make it go away again? This time is different, the agent said. This time there's video evidence. Multiple witnesses. Multiple victims. And this time the base commander isn't backing down. Then yes, Victoria said, her voice stronger. Yes, I'll make a statement. I should have fought harder the first time. Maybe if I had, that captain wouldn't have gone through what she did. The additional evidence was devastating. It showed a clear pattern spanning years and multiple duty stations. It showed systematic cover-ups and abuse of power. And it showed that Porter's behavior had been enabled by people who cared more about political connections than about justice. But Congressman Porter wasn't done fighting. He held a press conference in Washington. Standing at a podium with his nephew beside him, he painted a very different picture. My nephew is a dedicated officer who has served his country with honor, the congressman said, cameras flashing. This rush to judgment, this trial by social media, is exactly what's wrong with our culture today. One accident, One moment that's been taken completely out of context and a young man's entire career is being destroyed. A reporter raised her hand. "Congressman, there's video evidence of your nephew striking Captain Hayes and dumping food on her. How is that out of context?" "My nephew was defending himself," Porter said smoothly. Captain Hayes had been confrontational with him on multiple occasions. On this particular day, she deliberately spilled hot coffee on him, and when he reacted defensively, she played the victim. "The military justice system will prove his innocence." Rebecca watched the press conference from her barracks room, her blood boiling. The lies were so blatant, so obvious, but she knew some people would believe them. Some people wanted to believe them. Her phone rang. It was Colonel Williams. "I just watched it too," Williams said without preamble. "Don't let it get to you. He's desperate, and desperate people say desperate things." "He called me confrontational," Rebecca said. "Said I deliberately spilled coffee on him. That's not what happened. We have video evidence of what happened. We have multiple witnesses. We have his pattern of behavior at other bases. We have everything we need." Williams paused. "But I need to ask you something. How are you holding up?" "Really?" Rebecca thought about lying, about saying she was fine. But Williams deserved honesty. "I'm tired. I'm angry, and I'm starting to understand why so many people don't report these things. This process is almost as bad as what happened in the first place." "I know," Williams said quietly. "I've been there myself. 20 years ago, different circumstances, but the same pressure. The same attempts to make me back down. And I almost did. I came this close to just accepting a transfer and moving on." "What made you keep fighting?" "I thought about the next woman," Williams said. "The one who would deal with the same person if I didn't stop him. I thought about whether I could live with myself knowing I had the chance to make a difference and chose the easy path instead." She paused. "You're not just fighting for yourself, Rebecca. You're fighting for every soldier who comes after you. That's worth remembering when it gets hard." After they hung up, Rebecca sat in the quiet of her room. The evening sun was setting outside her window, casting long shadows across the base. She thought about what Williams had said. About Victoria Reyes, who'd been pressured into silence. About all the other soldiers who'd come forward with their own stories. About the ones who hadn't come forward, who were watching to see if this time would be different. She pulled out her laptop and opened her journal. She'd been writing in it every day since the incident, documenting not just the facts but her feelings, her struggles, her moments of doubt. Maybe someday someone else would need to see this, would need to know that even when you're doing the right thing, it's still hard. That having courage doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing it anyway. Outside her window, she could see soldiers heading to the mess hall for dinner. The same mess hall where it had all happened. She hadn't been back there since that day. Couldn't bring herself to walk through those doors. But tomorrow she decided she would. She'd go to breakfast there, eat her meal, and show everyone that she wasn't hiding, wasn't running, wasn't backing down. The fight was far from over. But she was still standing. And that, she realized, was its own kind of victory. The morning Rebecca walked back into the mess hall, she felt every muscle in her body tense up. It had been 3 weeks since the incident. 3 weeks of avoiding this building, eating protein bars in her room, going to the small coffee shop off base instead. But today was different. Today she needed to prove something, if on. Lie to herself. She pushed through the doors at exactly 0700 hours. The breakfast crowd was in full swing. The moment she stepped inside, conversation stuttered and stopped, like someone had turned down the volume on the entire room. Heads turned. People stared. Rebecca kept her eyes forward and walked to the food line. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She picked up a tray, and the simple act of holding it brought back the memory of food dripping down her face, the sting of that slap, the humiliation of 300 people watching. But she didn't turn around. She moved through the line, selecting scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. When she reached the end, she scanned the room for a seat. That's when she noticed something. At a table near the center, 4 soldiers stood up. Then 4 more, then more. Within seconds, half the mess hall was standing, not saying a word, just standing there looking at her. Rebecca felt her throat tighten. She didn't know what this meant. Were they standing against her, for her? Then Sergeant Morrison, who'd come to check on her that first night, started clapping. Just a slow, steady clap. Another soldier joined in. Then another. Within moments, the entire mess hall was applauding. Rebecca stood there frozen, her tray shaking slightly in her hands. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected any of this. She nodded just once and made her way to an empty table. As she sat down, soldiers came by, one after another, some just nodding, others patting her shoulder, a few whispering words of support. "Thank you for not backing down," one young private said quietly. "You're braver than most people I know," said a sergeant she'd never even spoken to before. By the time she finished her breakfast, Rebecca felt something shift inside her. She wasn't alone in this. She'd never been alone in this. She just hadn't realized it until now. The court-martial was scheduled for 2 weeks out. The legal team was working around the clock preparing the case. Major Bradford met with Rebecca almost daily, going over testimony, preparing her for cross-examination, making sure every detail was locked down tight. "They're going to try to make you look emotional, unstable, someone who overreacted," Bradford explained during one session. "They'll bring up every negative thing they can find about you, every mistake you've ever made, even tiny ones. They want the panel to doubt you." "I understand," Rebecca said. "I'm ready. Are you?" Bradford looked at her seriously. "Because I need to tell you what's probably coming. They've hired Mitchell Kane as Porter's defense attorney." Rebecca felt her stomach drop. Even she knew that name. Mitchell Kane was famous in military legal circles. He'd gotten high-profile officers acquitted of charges that seemed ironclad. He was expensive, connected, and ruthless. "Of course they did," she said quietly. "The congressman's pulling out all the stops." "Kane is good at what he does," Bradford said. "But here's what you need to remember. He wins cases by making victims afraid to testify, by making them doubt themselves, by finding any crack in their story and wedging it open. Don't let him get in your head." The next few days felt like preparing for combat. Rebecca reviewed her statements over and over. She watched the video of the incident so many times she could recite every second of it. She met with a counselor provided by the base to help her manage the stress. At night, she barely slept, running through potential questions in her mind. Then, 5 days before the court-martial, something happened that changed everything. Congressman Porter made a critical mistake. He sent an email to Colonel Williams. It was late at night, and perhaps he'd been drinking. Or perhaps he was just so used to getting his way that he didn't think about the consequences. The email was direct and threatening. "Colonel Williams," it read, "I've been patient with this witch hunt against my nephew, but my patience is running out. I have considerable influence in Congress, including on the Armed Services Committee. I can make your next promotion very difficult, or I can make it very easy. The choice is yours. I strongly suggest you reconsider the charges against Lieutenant Porter and handle this matter quietly and internally. These things don't need to destroy careers on both sides." Colonel Williams read the email 3 times. Then she forwarded it to the Inspector General's office, the base legal team, and the CID. She also saved multiple copies in different locations. By morning, the email was in the hands of people far above her pay grade, and the congressman's attempt to threaten a military officer was now part of an official investigation. When Rebecca heard about it, she could barely believe it. "He put it in writing? He actually put a threat in writing?" "Never underestimate the arrogance of people who've never faced real consequences," Bradford said. And for the first time since this whole thing started, he was smiling. "This changes everything. This isn't just about Porter anymore. This is about congressional interference in military justice. The Inspector General's office is taking this very seriously." The news leaked within 24 hours. Of course it did. Something this big couldn't stay quiet. The headlines were immediate and brutal. "Congressman threatens military officer over nephew's assault case." Cable news picked it up. Social media exploded. The narrative that the congressman had been trying to control was suddenly spinning completely out of his hands. Political opponents smelled blood in the water. Ethics complaints were filed. Calls for investigation came from both sides of the aisle. Other members of Congress, particularly women and veterans, started speaking out about the case. The congressman tried to claim the email had been taken out of context, misunderstood, but the words were right there in black and white for everyone to see. Rebecca watched the news coverage from her room, feeling something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope, real hope. The kind that wasn't just about her case, but about something bigger, about accountability actually meaning something. Her phone rang. It was her father. "I'm watching this unfold on the news," he said. "Sweetheart, do you understand what you've done? You haven't just stood up for yourself. You've exposed something rotten. This congressman, his nephew, the whole system that protected them. It's all coming apart. I didn't mean for it to get this big, Dad. I just wanted justice for what happened to me. I know. But sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. You did that. You're still doing that. The days before the court-martial felt different now. The pressure was still there, but it had shifted. Porter's defense team was scrambling. They filed motion after motion, trying to delay, trying to separate the assault case from the new investigation into the congressman, trying to find any angle that might help. But Major Bradford and his team blocked every attempt. Rebecca met with Victoria Reyes, the soldier from Germany who'd come forward about her own experience with Porter. They talked for hours over video chat, two women who'd never met but who understood each other perfectly. I was so angry at myself for not fighting harder back then, Victoria said. But watching you, seeing how hard this is even with video evidence and support, I understand now why I didn't. It's not weakness to be scared. It's not cowardice to back down when the whole system is against you. But you're not backing down now, Rebecca said. You're here. You're testifying. That takes just as much courage. We're doing this together, Victoria replied. That's what makes it possible. The night before the court-martial, Rebecca couldn't sleep at all. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. One spilled coffee, one moment of collision in a crowded mess hall. And now hundreds of lives were affected, careers were hanging in the balance, and a system that had protected abusers for years was finally being challenged. She thought about all the people who'd come forward, all the stories shared, all the soldiers who'd told her privately that watching her fight had given them the courage to report their own experiences with harassment and abuse. The ripple effects went far beyond Fort Anderson now. At 0500, she gave up on sleep and got up. She put on her dress uniform carefully, making sure every detail was perfect, every ribbon in exactly the right place, every crease sharp, her boots polished to a mirror shine. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a soldier, not a victim, not someone broken by what had happened, a soldier who was about to walk into a courtroom and demand accountability. Colonel Williams had told her something the day before that she kept replaying in her mind. Win or lose tomorrow, you've already changed things. You've already shown every soldier on this base and beyond that fighting back is possible, that the system can work if you're willing to push it hard enough. That's a victory that no verdict can take away. Rebecca checked her watch. 0600. Time to go. She took one last look around her room, picked up the folder containing her testimony notes and walked out the door. The sun was just starting to rise over Fort Anderson, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was going to be a long day, maybe the longest of her life, but she was ready. Whatever happened in that courtroom, she would face it standing tall, telling the truth and refusing to back down. Because that's what soldiers did. They stood their ground even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. And today Rebecca Hayes was going to show everyone exactly what that And the courtroom was smaller than Rebecca had imagined. She'd seen military courts on television, big dramatic spaces with high ceilings and lots of people. This was more intimate, which somehow made it feel more intense. The panel of officers who would decide Porter's fate sat at the front. Porter himself sat at the defense table in his dress uniform, his face carefully neutral. His expensive attorney, Mitchell Kane, looked relaxed and confident. Rebecca sat behind the prosecution table with Major Bradford. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she concentrated on keeping her breathing steady. The room was packed with observers, media representatives in the designated area, and soldiers who'd been given permission to attend. Colonel Williams sat in the front row, her presence a quiet reminder of why this mattered. The trial lasted 3 days. 3 days of testimony, evidence, cross-examination, and arguments. Rebecca watched as the prosecution laid out their case piece by piece. The video of the incident was played multiple times. Each viewing made her stomach clench, but she kept her face calm. Witnesses testified about what they'd seen. The mess hall supervisor confirmed there had been no prior confrontations between Rebecca and Porter. The medical officer who'd examined Rebecca's face after the incident described the bruising consistent with being slapped. When it was Rebecca's turn to testify, she walked to the stand with her head high. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. Major Bradford took her through her testimony step by step. What happened that day, how she'd bumped into Porter, The coffee spill, her immediate apology, and then the assault. Can you describe what happened after you apologized? Bradford asked. Lieutenant Porter became very angry, Rebecca said, her voice steady. He raised his voice, called me stupid, and before I could respond, he slapped me across the face. Then he grabbed my tray and dumped all the food on me. And what did you do in response? I wiped food from my eye, said understood, Lieutenant, and left the mess hall. Why didn't you defend yourself physically? Rebecca took a breath. Because I'm a soldier and an officer. I know the regulations. I know that responding with violence would have made me the one facing charges. I also knew that everyone was watching. Many were recording. And how I handled that moment would define everything that came after. Then it was Mitchell Kane's turn. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and approached with a practiced smile. Captain Hayes, you have quite an impressive record, don't you? 2 Bronze Stars, multiple commendations. You're clearly ambitious. I'm dedicated to my service, Rebecca replied carefully. Ambitious people sometimes look for opportunities to advance their careers, don't they? A high-profile case like this could certainly raise your profile. I didn't want a high-profile case. I wanted justice for being assaulted. Kane walked closer. You say my client became very angry after you spilled hot coffee on him. Isn't it true that you had coffee on multiple other occasions when Lieutenant Porter was present in the mess hall? Rebecca blinked, confused by the question. I drink coffee most days, yes. Like most soldiers. So you were familiar with Lieutenant Porter? Had seen him around the base before this incident? I'd seen him, yes. We'd never had any personal interactions before that day. Kane smiled slightly. You'd never had personal interactions, yet you immediately recognized him, knew his rank, knew his name? His name tag was visible. His rank was on his uniform. That's how military uniforms work. A few quiet chuckles came from the gallery. Kane's smile tightened. Let me ask you directly. Captain Hayes, isn't it true that you deliberately targeted my client because of his family connections? Hoping that filing charges against a congressman's nephew would get you attention? Rebecca felt anger flash through her but kept her voice level. That's absolutely false. I had no idea he was related to anyone in Congress until days after the incident. I filed charges because an officer assaulted me in front of hundreds of witnesses. Kane tried several more angles, attempting to poke holes in her story, to make her seem calculating or dishonest. But Rebecca had lived this moment. She knew exactly what had happened. And every time Kane tried to twist her words, she calmly brought it back to the simple truth. Victoria Reyes testified via video link from Germany. She described her own experience with Porter, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger as she spoke. Kane tried to discredit her too, suggesting she was jumping on a bandwagon looking for attention. But Victoria held firm. I stayed silent for 2 years, she said, tears in her eyes. 2 years of guilt, wondering if he did this to someone else because I didn't speak up. I'm not here for attention. I'm here because it's the right thing to do, even though it's 2 years too late. Other witnesses from Fort Anderson testified. Then the prosecution brought in their surprise element. They'd tracked down a soldier from Fort Carson, Porter's previous duty station. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had never filed an official complaint, but he'd witnessed Porter shove a junior enlisted soldier so hard, the young man had fallen and injured his wrist. Torres had reported it to his chain of command verbally, but nothing had come of it. Why didn't you push harder for action? Bradford asked. Because word came down that Porter was connected, that making trouble for him was career suicide, Torres said. I was 3 years from retirement. I'm not proud of it, but I chose to keep my head down. The defense called character witnesses for Porter, fellow officers who described him as professional and dedicated. But on cross-examination, Bradford got several of them to admit they'd never actually worked closely with Porter, didn't know him outside of official duties. Their testimony felt hollow compared to the specific, detailed accounts from his victims. On the final day, both sides gave closing arguments. Kane painted Porter as a young officer who'd had a momentary lapse in judgment after being injured by hot coffee, blown out of proportion by social media and political agendas. Bradford systematically dismantled that narrative, pointing to the pattern of behavior, the multiple victims, the attempted cover-ups, and the congressman's interference. This isn't about one bad moment, Bradford told the panel. This is about an officer who believed the rules didn't apply to him, who believed his family name protected him from consequences, and about a system that proved him right over and over until Captain Hayes refused to be another silent victim. The panel deliberated for 6 hours. Rebecca sat in a waiting room, unable to eat, barely able to sit still. Colonel Williams sat with her for part of it, not saying much, just being present. When the call finally came that the panel had reached a verdict, Rebecca felt like she might throw up. Back in the courtroom, everyone stood as the panel filed in. The senior member, a stern-faced colonel with 30 years of service, held the verdict document. Rebecca's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear. In the case of United States versus Lieutenant David Porter, on the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conduct unbecoming an officer, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of cruelty and maltreatment, we find the defendant guilty. Rebecca felt her knees weaken. Guilty. On all counts. She heard gasps and murmurs from the gallery but couldn't process any of it. Major Bradford was shaking her hand, but she felt like she was underwater, everything muffled and distant. The sentencing came an hour later. Porter was stripped of his rank, given a dishonorable discharge, and sentenced to 6 months in military prison. His military career was over. His future prospects were shattered. As military police led him from the courtroom, he didn't look at Rebecca once. Outside, reporters swarmed, but base security kept them at a distance. Rebecca stood on the courthouse steps, Colonel Williams beside her, trying to process what had just happened. She'd won. Actually won. The system had worked, but the story didn't end there. The Inspector General's investigation into Congressman Porter continued. Within 2 months, he announced he wouldn't seek re-election, citing a desire to spend more time with family. Everyone knew what that really meant. His political career was effectively over, ended by his own arrogance and the threatening email he'd sent to Colonel Williams. Fort Anderson implemented new policies: an anonymous reporting system for harassment complaints, mandatory training on proper conduct, a victim advocacy program. Colonel Williams appointed Rebecca to head a task force examining these issues across the base, with an eye toward creating a model other installations could follow. The changes rippled outward. Other bases took notice. The Department of Defense launched a broader review of how harassment complaints were handled military-wide. Soldiers who'd been suffering in silence started coming forward, not just at Fort Anderson, but everywhere. The reporting numbers went up dramatically, and while some people tried to spin that as a negative, Rebecca knew better. It meant people finally felt safe enough to speak up. 6 months after the court-martial, Rebecca was promoted to major. The promotion ceremony was small, just her unit and a few friends. As Colonel Williams pinned the new rank on her uniform, she leaned in and whispered, "You earned this through your service, not through what happened. Never forget that." But Rebecca knew the truth was more complex. Yes, she'd earned her promotion through years of dedicated service. But standing up when it mattered, refusing to back down,